On the 1st of November 1944, one of the finest interceptor squadrons in the Japanese army climbed for nearly an hour into a cloudless sky over Tokyo. Their target was one American aircraft, just one flying alone. No escort, no bombs, they never reached it. 1,000 meters short of the enemy, their engines simply stopped climbing. The device that made that American aircraft impossible to catch had been sitting in a hangar outside Tokyo for 18 months. Japanese engineers had taken it apart, photographed it, published the drawings in a magazine anyone could buy. They understood it perfectly, and they still could not build one. The reason has nothing to do with engineering. It has to do with a percentage in a mining report, a cable signed 9 months before Pearl Harbor, and a substance you probably have in your mouth right now. This is the story of why Japan's engineers could not explain how the B-29 flew above every fighter they had. And it begins at 5:55 in the morning on a coral runway on Saipan. A single American aircraft lifted off and turned north. Captain Ralph Steakley had a crew, 3 cameras and no bombs. 14 hours of flying ahead of him, almost all of it over open ocean. Years later, when the war was long over and the men who flew it were growing old, he said the same thing every time somebody asked. They did not know what to expect. They were excited. He was flying an F-13, a stripped-down variant of the newest bomber in the American arsenal, with the bomb bays sealed and the belly rebuilt to carry cameras where explosives had been. No target that morning, no release point, just a city and enough film to photograph every square meter of it. They knew they had arrived when they saw the snow on Mount Fuji. Then for 35 minutes, Steakley flew slow figure 8s over the capital of an empire at war. 32,000 feet, 9,800 meters. Clear sky in every direction, horizon to horizon, on what would turn out to be the only completely cloudless day over the Japanese home islands in the entire bombing campaign that was still at that moment 6 months from truly beginning. Nobody could know that yet. Beneath him, air raid sirens began to wail across Tokyo. Beneath him, the Nakajima Aircraft Engine Works turned out cylinders and crankshafts for the fighters that would try to stop him. Beneath him, 7,000 photographs were being exposed, one after another, through a hole cut into the floor of a machine that had been on the island for less than 48 hours. At 1 in the afternoon, fighters of the 47th Sentai began taking off from Narimasu Airfield to kill him. Nakajima Ki-44s, Shoki, the Demon Queller, the best pure interceptor the Japanese army possessed, flown by the unit that Army headquarters had rated the top formation in the entire 10th Air Division only weeks earlier. They climbed for most of an hour, and then, roughly 1,000 meters short of him, they simply stopped climbing. 2 formations fired their machine guns into empty air beneath his belly. Anti-aircraft batteries opened up across the city and burst their shells uselessly below him. On the streets of Tokyo, ordinary people came out of doorways and stood in the road and watched. And something changed in the capital that afternoon that no bomb had yet managed to change. Here is the part that should stop you. Nothing on that aircraft was a secret. The one component that mattered had already been in Japanese hands for 18 months in a hangar outside Tokyo, taken apart, reassembled, photographed, drawn, and published in a magazine that any citizen could buy at a newsstand. The Japanese had the American instruction manuals. Their best engineers understood exactly how it worked and had said so in print before the war ever reached the home islands. So the answer to why they still could not do it is not a machine. And not a trick and not a secret, it is a substance. One particular metal, cast one particular way, dug out of one particular part of the earth. And it comes with a date, a shipping contract, and a percentage so small it looks like a typing error. It is, in the most literal sense, not an engineering answer at all. Which is exactly why no engineering report written in Japan was ever able to say it out loud. Start where the problem was felt first, 9,000 meters below Steakley. In the cockpit of one of the fighters that could not reach him, flown by a second lieutenant who had joined the unit 2 weeks earlier. His name was Oishi Sadao. He had arrived in the middle of October 1944, and the first thing he noticed about the Shoki was the shape of it. An enormous engine hung on the nose, the Nakajima Ha-109. About 1,500 horsepower, and behind it a wing so small he thought it looked like a duck's. No aircraft built during the war landed faster. The elevator was so sensitive that pulling too hard on final approach would fly you back off the runway. When one crashed, the fuselage tended to snap behind the pilot's seat, and the front half would roll over a few times and then drag itself along the ground upside down. That, he said, was what an accident normally looked like. Pilots were being sent to this machine straight from the Hayabusa with 200 hours in their logbooks, and the army expected them not to die. The first time Oishi landed one, his eyes were bloodshot. Told to take off again immediately, he found the aircraft would not leave the ground. He worked out that the propeller pitch lever was still set for cruise. He moved it. He got airborne. After 3 or 4 circuits, it stopped being terrifying, and he came to like it. Good speed. No vices once you knew them. Then came the 1st of November. Everything in the Kanto region that could fly went up that day. Oishi climbed with the rest, and somewhere in the middle of that climb his oil pressure began to fall. Not fail, fall steadily, the needle drifting down as the air thinned around him. At 7,000 meters it was very nearly at 0. The engine was barely running, and at exactly that moment he saw them. The American aircraft above him, unhurried, going about their business. He could not reach them, the gap was too large, but he could not simply sit there and watch either. So he lifted the nose, and he reached for the cannon button. His aircraft stalled, that is the whole encounter. A trained pilot in his country's best interceptor over his own capital on a clear day with the enemy in plain sight, and the airplane fell out from under him before he could fire a shot. Afterward, a young officer carried the combat report to headquarters. Staff officer read it and shouted a question that Oishi never forgot. Why the hell didn't you ram the enemy bombers with your planes? Sit with that for a second. Not what altitude did you reach? Not what was your oil pressure, not what could we do differently next time. The first instinct of the man behind the desk was not to ask what the machine had done. It was to demand that the pilot make up the difference with his body. That reflex reaching for flesh when the engineering falls short is going to run all the way through this story. And it starts here on day 1, before a single bomb had fallen on Tokyo. So what actually happened to that engine? Nothing exotic. Physics happened. An internal combustion engine is not really a machine that burns fuel. It is a machine that burns oxygen, and fuel is simply the thing you mix with the oxygen. At sea level, the air around you weighs about 1¼ kilograms per cubic meter. At 10,000 meters it weighs about 400 grams. Roughly a third. Every stroke of every cylinder draws in a third of the oxygen it was designed to swallow. So it can burn a third of the fuel, so it makes something like a third of the power. While the airframe still weighs precisely what it weighed on the runway. Imagine sprinting up a staircase while someone slowly pinches the straw you are breathing through. You do not stop instantly, you get slower and slower. And then you are simply standing there with your legs still moving. Every Air Force on Earth knew this, and every Air Force had the same answer. The supercharger, a blower geared off the crankshaft, cramming air into the cylinders faster than the atmosphere could supply it. The Ha-109 in Oishi's Shoki had one, with 2 speeds. It worked beautifully. That point has a name. Critical altitude. Below it, the blower keeps the engine fed. Above it, the blower itself is spinning in air too thin to compress, and the power curve falls away like a cliff. And there is a second cost that never appears in the brochure. A gear-driven blower is powered by the engine it is feeding. It is a tax. You are burning your own crankshaft to buy air. Now, look at what that meant in numbers, because the numbers are stranger than the story suggests. The Shoki was not a bad climber, it was a superb one. From a standing start, it reached 5,000 meters in 4 minutes and 17 seconds. A figure that would have impressed any Air Force in the world. Its listed service ceiling was 11,200 meters, comfortably above anything the Americans were flying over Tokyo, and it still could not get there in time or fight when it arrived. Both facts are true, and the space between them is where this entire war in the air was decided. Service ceiling is a technical definition, the altitude at which an aircraft can still manage a token rate of climb. 100 feet per minute on a good day, lightly loaded, flown perfectly. It is not a fighting altitude. A fighter at its service ceiling has no spare power for anything. No acceleration, no climb, no second attempt. The controls go soft, the machine mushes. As one American account later put it, the aircraft up there floated more than it flew. And suppose you did get there, suppose the engine held and the oil held and you arrived at 9,000 meters with the enemy in front of you. Then what? Then you met the second half of the problem. Outside the canopy it is around 50 degrees below zero. Glass frosts over from the inside, hands and gloves lose fine control. The pilot is breathing through a mask at the edge of what supplemental oxygen can sustain, and is thinking a little more slowly than he believes he is. And with the airframe hanging on the edge of a stall, he gets one firing pass. There is no coming back around for another, because coming around costs energy he cannot spare. So one pass at closing speed against a target bristling with heavy machine guns pointing back at him. The Army's answer was to give him a bigger gun. Some Shoki carried the Ho 301. 40mm cannon firing caseless ammunition. Compact, devastating, and firing shells so slowly that they were useful only at point-blank range, with very few rounds aboard. To hit anything with it, you had to be close enough that you were already most of the way to a collision. Follow that sequence, and you can watch an entire air force being pushed, one technical step at a time toward a conclusion nobody had yet said out loud. This is the first link in the chain, and it is worth stating plainly. The failure over Tokyo on the 1st of November was not a failure of courage, or of training, or even of aircraft design. Every needle in Oishi's cockpit was telling the truth. Above a certain line in the sky, his engine had quietly stopped being an engine. And the men on the ground knew it. Within weeks, the mechanics of the 47th had gone after the oil problem with the only tools they had. They fitted a larger diameter oil pipe, and suddenly the Shoki would hold together up to 9,500 meters. That is a remarkable piece of work by tired men with no resources. It is also, if you look at it coldly, an answer to the wrong question. They had bought 2.5 kilometers. They had not touched the reason the climb took an hour. There is one more detail from that day, and it is the strangest of all. Oishi remembered the American formation at 12,000 meters. The American records say 9,800. He was not lying, and he was not a fool. He was a fighter pilot with a working altimeter, looking up at an aircraft he could not approach. And his mind supplied a number that matched the impossibility of what he was seeing. The defenders of Tokyo could not reach the intruders, could not catch them, and on the first day could not even measure them correctly. Every part of the problem, the climb, the guns, the estimate, was being solved in a world where the fundamental quantity was missing. And what was missing precisely was this, at 32,000 feet. In air that had taken 2/3 of the oxygen away from every engine in the sky. The 4 engines above Tokyo were not making 1/3 of their power. They were making all of it, every last horsepower. Full rated output, cruise settings undisturbed, as if the airplane were still sitting on the runway at Saipan with the sun on its wings. That was the number the Japanese could not produce. Not because they did not know how, but because the answer to how was not written anywhere on the aircraft. It was written on a shipping contract, filed away in a government office on the other side of the world, and on a percentage in a mining report, and on the geological history of an island in the South Pacific that had quietly at the beginning of 1941 been carried onto a different side of the war. To understand any of that you have to go back 26 years. To a mountain in Colorado, to a man nobody had made a film about, to an engine dragged up a dirt road in a wooden crate, because the wheel that decided the sky over Tokyo was first spun there. On a bare stone pad at 14,000 feet in freezing air by a 46-year-old engineer who had spent 2 decades being told that his obsession was a dead end. His name was Sanford Alexander Moss, and in September of 1918, on top of Pikes Peak, he was about to prove that the 20th century's air war had already been decided. Not in a design office, in a mine, September 1918. A group of General Electric engineers rode a train 1,300 miles from Massachusetts to Colorado Springs. They carried with them a 400 horsepower Liberty L-12 aero engine, a dynamometer to measure its output, and enough supplies to camp on a mountain for 6 weeks. Then they drove the whole assembly up the unpaved Pikes Peak Auto Highway, 23 miles of switchbacks, to a small pad at 14,109 feet. And they started running the engine in the freezing air. The man in charge was Sanford Alexander Moss. He was 46 years old. He had written his Cornell doctoral thesis on the gas turbine back in 9903, when the airplane itself was barely out of the sand at Kitty Hawk. And for most of the 2 decades since, his life's obsession had been considered a charming dead end. He had worked at General Electric's plant in Lynn, Massachusetts, alongside Charles Steinmetz and Elihu Thomson on steam turbines and blast furnace compressors. Solid, reliable, profitable machinery. His actual dream, a turbine driven by burning gas, kept failing for one reason, which he stated himself, and which you should file away for the rest of this story. There were no metals that could take the heat. Earlier that year, one of his test rigs had been fired up behind a wall of sandbags, with the observers taking cover. Within minutes it exploded and threw spark plugs through the roof of the test house. That was where the science of high-temperature gas turbines stood in 1918. Up on the mountain, Moss and his team ran 25 tests. Without his device, the Liberty engine made 354 horsepower at ground level, and 230 at 14,000 feet. With his device, at 14,000 feet, the engine produced around 356. Read those last 2 figures again, because that is the moment the 20th century's air war got decided. Not better at altitude, not improved. The engine at 14,000 feet made the same power as the engine on the ground. The concept was almost insultingly simple, which is why it took a turbine man to see it. Every piston engine ever built throws away most of the energy in its fuel as hot exhaust gas. A scalding, high-velocity jet blasting out of the stacks and vanishing into the slipstream. A geared supercharger taxes the crankshaft to get its air. Moss's device taxed nothing. It put a small turbine wheel directly in the exhaust stream, let the waste gas spin it, and connected the wheel by a shaft to a compressor that rammed dense air back into the engine. The engine's own garbage was fed back to it as breakfast. Free power out of the exhaust, which is why the world's air forces looked at it, understood it perfectly, and mostly walked away. They walked away because of the wheel. This is the center of the whole story. And it is not a large object. Picture something you could hold in 2 hands. A bladed disc machined to a few thousandths of an inch, bolted to a shaft. Now spin it past 20,000 revolutions a minute. Later marks ran to 24,000. At those speeds, the blades are trying to tear themselves off the hub with a force many thousand times gravity. Now, while it is doing that, run engine exhaust across it continuously. Not warm air, gas from a gasoline engine at full throttle, well over 700 degrees Celsius, in the range where ordinary steel glows and goes soft like taffy on a summer sidewalk. Now do that for hundreds of hours, without the wheels stretching, or cracking, or warping out of balance, or coming apart and taking the nacelle with it. Do it on every one of the 8 units bolted to a single aircraft. 2 turbochargers per engine on a B-29, all 4 engines. Do it on aircraft after aircraft, often on assembly lines built by people who had been welders and shop clerks 2 years earlier. That is the entire secret. Everything else, the ducting, the intercoolers, the wastegates, the pilot's control levers, is plumbing around one small wheel that must not melt. So where did the metal come from? From a dental laboratory. The alloy family the Americans eventually settled on was stellite, cobalt and chromium, originally worked out at the turn of the century for cutting tools. Extremely hard, extremely brittle, and far too tough to forge. It sat there being interesting and useless until a New York firm called Austinal Laboratories developed a lost wax casting process to make artificial teeth out of it. And because stainless steel dentures needed a friendlier name, they marketed the result as Vitalium. Wartime demand made forging turbine blades impossible anyway. So Ostinel adapted their denture process, and from late 1941 on, a cast cobalt chrome alloy became the standard material for turbine blades in American turbochargers, and shortly after that in the first jet engines. Stop and appreciate that. The single most heat-punished component in the most advanced bomber ever flown was made by a technique perfected for false teeth. There is no grand strategy in that. There is no genius plan drawn up in some War Department office. There is only a very deep industrial economy in which somebody, somewhere, has already solved your problem for an entirely unrelated reason. And the two of you can find each other, an economy in which a man who spent his career making molars for dentists suddenly finds himself pouring the blades that will let bombers cruise above every fighter on Earth. There is one more piece of plumbing worth naming now, because it comes back later with a vengeance. Compress air and you heat it. Squeeze enough of it into a duct to restore sea level pressure at 30,000 feet and it arrives hot. Hot enough to thin out again, hot enough to push the engine toward detonation. Which is the thing that destroys engines. So between the compressor and the carburetor you have to fit a radiator for air. An intercooler with its own ducting, its own drag, its own volume inside an airframe that has no spare volume. Everyone who ever attempted this ran into that wall. What decided the outcome was whether your aircraft was big enough and your fuel good enough to pay the penalty. The Americans had both, and they used the device everywhere. Turbochargers went onto the Flying Fortress and the Liberator, onto the twin-boomed Lightning, and onto the enormous Thunderbolt, which is a large part of why American fighters over Europe kept working at heights where their opponents began to sag. General Electric opened a dedicated department at Lynn to build them, after a large army order arrived in 1937. 2 years before the war in Europe started, by 1944 the arrangement had reached its final form. 4 engines, 2 units apiece, 8 small wheels spinning in the exhaust of one airplane. Then there was the other half, the half that gets forgotten. Because it is not glamorous, the crew. A human being has a critical altitude too. Above about 8,000 meters, supplemental oxygen through a mask stops being enough for sustained work. Hands get clumsy, judgment blurs. The cold reaches into the airframe until instruments freeze. Boeing's answer was to pressurize. The nose and cockpit formed one sealed compartment. The gunner station another, and because the bomb bays could not be pressurized, they had to open in flight. So the engineers ran a padded tunnel over the top of them, so a man could crawl between the two. Air bled from the superchargers held the cabin at the equivalent of 8,000 feet. All the way up to 30,000, conditioned to around 70 degrees Fahrenheit. At the altitude where Oishi's engine was starving and his airframe was mushing and his hands were going numb, the men above him were working in shirt sleeves in a warm room. 30 minutes before combat they depressurized on purpose, so that a single cannon shell would not turn the fuselage into a bomb. And none of this was classified. In January 1943, General Electric published a plain language pamphlet explaining the turbo supercharger and the airplane power plant. By the end of that December, it had been reissued as a United States Army technical manual. General Electric and Ford, between them, built more than 300,000 turbochargers during the war. This was not a jealously guarded miracle. It was a mass-produced industrial commodity, described in an instruction book, and that fact is going to matter enormously in a few minutes. Sanford Moss retired in 1938. He was awarded the Collier Trophy 2 years later. At 65 he came back to work on the same problem. He died in 1946 in Lynn, Massachusetts, and no film has ever been made about him. Because here is what happened next. The bomber built to carry 8 of Moss's turbochargers to Japan very nearly never reached Japan at all. On a February afternoon in Seattle, the entire program came down in flames onto a meat packing plant. At 12:09 in the afternoon, on February 18th, 1943, Edmund T. Allen took off from Boeing Field. Everyone called him Eddie. He had flown in the last war, become one of the first test pilots for the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the outfit that would eventually become NASA. And by 1943 he was widely regarded as the best in the world at a job that was still being invented. A rough combination of pilot and engineer, a man who could feel a fault and then explain it in equations. He was flying the second prototype, serial number 413. In its whole life, the aircraft had made 8 flights, totaling 7 hours and 27 minutes. On its very first flight 6 weeks earlier, an engine had caught fire. And Alan had brought it home anyway. Flight 9 was to measure climb performance to 25,000 feet and gather engine cooling data. At 12:17, passing 5,000 feet, the number 1 engine caught fire. The onboard extinguishers went off and the fire went out. Then it came back and spread across the wing, and there was nothing left to fight it with. Alan turned for the field 20 miles out and losing height. 2 men jumped. Their parachutes did not have time to open. The burning aircraft crossed downtown Seattle low enough that people in an office on the 21st floor of the Exchange building watched it go by. It clipped power lines. At 12:26 it hit the fry meat packing plant, short of the runway, with nearly 5,000 gallons of gasoline aboard. The employees inside were at lunch. Alan and his crew died. Around 20 plant workers died, and a firefighter who went into the building afterward died of the fumes. Read the sequence one more time. The machine designed to cruise where no fighter on Earth could follow. Could not climb through 5,000 feet without burning. That was not bad luck. The Wright R3350 was an 18-cylinder monster with a magnesium crankcase, rushed into service years ahead of its natural development. And it ran hot, and it caught fire, a habit it never entirely lost. Engine fires would kill more Superfortress crews than the Japanese did. The partial cure came out of a laboratory rather than a factory. Engineers at the government's Aircraft Engine Research Laboratory mounted a full-scale R3000-350 in a test rig, and attacked the overheating directly, eventually producing a redesigned impeller that lifted the flow rate through the fuel injection system. It is one of the more consequential and least celebrated pieces of American engineering of the war. It made the engine survivable, it never made it friendly. And the program could not be cancelled because of what it had already cost. Development ran to roughly $3 billion wartime dollars. The Manhattan Project, the entire atomic bomb effort, every laboratory and reactor and enrichment plant, came in around $2 billion. America built a more expensive airplane than the bomb. The airplane was later built to carry. By January 1944, aircraft were pouring off the lines at Wichita, and none of them could go to war. Engineering changes had arrived faster than the assembly line could absorb them. So finished airframes were being flown to modification centers to be finished by hand. And there were not enough hangars, so the work happened outdoors. In Kansas, in winter. On January 11th, General Hap Arnold walked the Wichita line, picked out the 175th fuselage, signed his name on it, and said, "This is the plane I want." He wanted it in service before the 1st of March. He came back on March 9th. Not one was combat ready. Some had been sitting for 2 months, waiting for parts. What followed got a name of its own, the Battle of Kansas. A general was handed Arnold's personal authority. 600 workers were pulled off the Wichita line and sent to the airfields. Subcontractors were told to stop everything else in the country until their Superfortress commitments were met. 1,200 technicians worked on frozen concrete at Salina and Pratt and Great Bend and Walker, in temperatures below zero, stripping wing plating off finished bombers, adding reinforcement and riveting it back on by hand. The first aircraft left for the war at the end of March. Getting them to the war settled nothing either. The first campaign against Japan was flown out of India, staging through improvised fields in China, with every gallon of fuel and every bomb hauled over the Himalayas by air. Between June 1944 and January 1945, that force made 9 raids on the home islands, and destroyed exactly one target of consequence, a small aircraft factory at Omura. It lost 125 aircraft doing it, of which only 22 to 29 were destroyed by the enemy. The rest were accidents. Its first commander was relieved after the opening raid because he could not mount a second one. This was never a story about effortless American superiority. It was a story about an aircraft that killed its own chief test pilot. Burned in the air with tedious regularity cost more than the atomic bomb, and had to be rebuilt outdoors in a Kansas blizzard before it could fight at all. Now the turn. While all of this was happening on the American side, the Japanese were not sitting still. In the spring of 1943, sitting in a hangar at Tachikawa in Japanese markings, there was an American 4-engined bomber with American turbo superchargers on it. The story of how it got there begins in the last week of December 1941, when Clark Field in the Philippines was abandoned to the advancing Japanese army. What remained was mostly wreckage. America's heavy bomber force in Asia had been caught on the ground in the opening hours of the war. Of 17 flying fortresses there, not one was flyable. A team of specialists arrived from the Kokugijutsu Kenkyujo, the Japanese Army's Aviation Technical Research Institute. They walked the field collecting fragments, and their attention settled almost at once on the buoys. Among the things they carried away from those burned airframes were the turbo superchargers. That was step one. Step two was more ambitious, working the same scrap heap the same way the American mechanics had. A wing here, a tail there, undamaged engines from somewhere else. Japanese technicians assembled one complete airworthy machine. And late in 9942 it lifted off Clark's runway with a crew flown down from the home islands, still wearing its American serial number under fresh rising sun markings. Bound for Japan, then Java fell and gave them 15 more wrecks, and captured mechanics to work on them. In May or June of 1943, escorted by fighters, 2 more rebuilt fortresses landed at Tachikawa. Technicians swarmed them before the propellers stopped. Major Kazuyuki Sido, an aeronautical engineer whose name survives in Japanese Army aviation records, ran the evaluation with a small team of lieutenants and assistants. An Army engineer named Kaneo was given the engines and went through every component and related system in detail. Individual parts were parceled out to outside specialists. One aircraft became a flying test bed for a captured American bomb site coupled to a captured automatic flight control system. And none of it was kept quiet. In February 1943, a Tokyo press house published a book of photographs of captured Allied aircraft, with particular attention to the fortresses. That May, an aviation magazine gave almost an entire issue to them. Nearly every major component reproduced in photographs and drawings. The Japanese also had the American instruction manuals. Nothing was overlooked. 18 months before the first superfortress appeared over Tokyo, a Japanese reader could walk into a shop, buy a magazine, and study detailed drawings of the exact class of device that would shortly make his country's air defense irrelevant. The reaction is worth knowing too. A year earlier, in the same magazine, Mitsubishi's chief designer of 2 of the Army's twin-engine bombers had reviewed the newest fortress and been distinctly unimpressed. Essentially modifications, he wrote, to an old design that first flew in 1935. Of a generation with aircraft already retired, he allowed that the underlying design was very good. But the tone is unmistakable. Nothing here we do not understand. He was right. That was the trap. They did understand it. So here is the link that the whole title of this story turns on. Robert Mikesh, who spent decades in the archives of Japanese aviation and later served as senior curator at the National Air and Space Museum, put the conclusion in a single clause. Japanese engineers plainly had the know-how to build an efficient turbocharged engine. They lacked the necessary materials. Start with nickel, the element that lets an alloy keep its strength when it is red hot. Japan has essentially none. The domestic Oyama deposit, being developed hard in 1940, ran at about 0.16% nickel. That is not a typo, 0.16%. Where had Japanese industry been buying it? Mostly from New Caledonia, a French island in the South Pacific whose ore ran at 3.8%. more than 20 times richer, and much of whose output went to Japan before the war. About 1,300 Japanese nationals worked those mines. In 939, sensing what was coming, Japan increased its orders. The door closed anyway, and you can watch it close in the paperwork. In December 1939, the United States extended its embargo on aircraft materials to cover molybdenum, aluminum, and nickel. In June 1940, France fell, and by the following year, New Caledonia had gone over to the Free French. In a secret cable dated March 19, 1941, 9 months before Pearl Harbor, the Australian government set out the arrangement. The Commonwealth would take the island's nickel matte, including matte from independent producers, and had arranged its onward sale to the International Nickel Company of the United States. The metal did not disappear, it changed sides. It went to the one company whose mines at Sudbury, Ontario, would supply about 95% of all Allied nickel demand for the entire war. £1.5 billion of it. Those same corporate laboratories, working in Britain, produced mnemonic 80 in 1941, the nickel-chromium alloy that made Frank Whittle's jet turbine blades survive. One company, one ore body, both sides of the problem. Then there is the fuel, which turns a shortage into a wall. More air in a cylinder means more pressure, and more pressure means the mixture wants to detonate. To explode all at once instead of burning, which punches a hole through a piston in seconds. The only defense is fuel that resists it. American engines ran on 130 grade. Japan started the war on 8791, was still on 8791 in 1945. And near the end was cutting it with the distillate pressed from pine roots, a desperate wartime program in which Japanese schoolchildren were sent into the forests to dig up tree roots to be distilled into aviation fuel. That final blend dragged the octane down to 85. Bolt a flawless turbocharger to an engine burning that. And it will wreck the engine. Now the programs, they were real. Numerous and serious. The Army had turbocharged designs underway from 1942 before a single superfortress had been seen. Nakajima, Tachikawa and Mitsubishi were all racing. And every program was running out of time. Mitsubishi's Ru 102 and Ru 104 turbo units went onto a series of aircraft. And the failures repeat with terrible consistency. No room in the airframe for an intercooler, so hot compressed air went straight to the carburetor. Exhaust collector rings assembled by hand, whose joints leaked so badly that when 3 prototypes of one fighter were built, each ended up with a different rated altitude. That detail is the whole war in miniature. 3 identical aircraft. 3 different ceilings, because 3 different pairs of hands made the joints. That is not a failure of intelligence, it is a failure to hold a tolerance. And here is where it stopped being an engineering story and became a human one. In the autumn of 1944, the commander of the 10th Air Division instructed every fighter regiment under him to form a special ramming flight of 3 or 4 aircraft. On December 5th, the Army formalized it across every air defense unit in the country. The Shinton Seikutai, the heaven-shaking air superiority units. Older airframes were stripped, armor out, guns out. Everything not needed to climb, and given to pilots skillful enough, the order specified to ram and then bail out and fly again. Later, the establishment rose to 8 per regiment, and there was formal instruction. At the training unit, approaches from the tail and from below were discouraged. Understand what an air force is saying when it takes the guns out of a fighter so it can reach the enemy. That is a technical report, written, signed, filed. It simply cannot be spoken aloud. The first of them to die in the Kanto sky was Corporal Yoshio Mita on November 24th, the man who rammed a superfortress of the 497th Bomb Group, and who came from Oishi's own squadron. On January 9th, 1945, a sergeant of the 47th Sentai went head-on into one. His aircraft was annihilated. The bomber lost an outboard engine, fell out of formation, and was finished off by others. And on that same day, Warrant Officer Awamura Takashi, a man his colleagues valued as the one who trained the young lieutenants, attacked twice. found himself out of ammunition on his third pass, and took the elevator off a superfortress with his propeller. He got out. His parachute came down in the sea, 20 kilometers from the nearest coast. Aircraft went looking. They did not find him. Across the whole campaign, ramming destroyed 9 American bombers and damaged 13 more, at a cost of 21 fighters and most of their pilots. Amid this, one man was rising who would come to define what the defense of Tokyo actually looked like. Teruhiko Kobayashi was born in Tokyo in November 1920. He trained as a bomber pilot, flew an obsolete light bomber at Hong Kong in the first month of the war, transferred to fighters in late 1943, and in late November 1944, at 24 years old, the youngest regimental commander in the Japanese Army Air Force was given the 244th Sentai at Chofu. Tasked with defending the capital, his pilots flew the Ki-61, one of the few Japanese fighters with genuinely good high-altitude manners, and a liquid-cooled engine that Kawasaki could never reliably build. He shot down his first superfortress on December 3, 1944. He was 24 years old, commanding men who were being asked, week by week, to trade their bodies for altitude their engines could not deliver. The winter was closing in around them. And on the other side of the ocean, in a hardened command post on Guam, a cigar-chewing general named Curtis LeMay was quietly doing arithmetic that was about to make everything they had built and everything they had died for irrelevant. He was going to bring the war down out of the sky. And when he did, it would not matter how high anyone could climb. The evening of March 9, 1945, 346 bombers left the Marianas for Tokyo. Most of their defensive guns had been removed. The gunners who normally manned them were left behind on the Coral Islands, standing on the runways, watching their aircraft climb out into the darkness without them. The bombers crossed the coast that night at around 5,000 feet. Curtis LeMay had done the arithmetic and reached a brutal conclusion. High-altitude precision bombing was not working. The winds were wrong. The clouds were wrong. The aborts were unforgivable. The Japanese night fighter force was weak. The anti-aircraft guns were much less effective in the dark. So strip the guns, load incendiaries, fly low, save the fuel and the weight, and burn the target instead of aiming at it. His crews hated the idea. They had been trained, from the first day of gunnery school to the last briefing on Guam, to believe that height and guns were what kept them alive. Now both were being taken away from them, and they were being sent in at rooftop level over a city defended by hundreds of anti-aircraft guns. 279 aircraft bombed that night. They dropped 1,665 tons, and they burned out 16 square miles of the city. 7% of Tokyo, a firestorm so vast that the water in the canals boiled in places, that the paint peeled off aircraft passing overhead in the thermal columns, that American crews at 8,000 feet could smell burning flesh through their oxygen masks. It remains the single most destructive air raid in the history of warfare. Somewhere between 80 and 100,000 people died. In one night, in a matter of hours, most of them civilians. Most of them in their own homes. 14 bombers were lost out of 346. To combat and mechanical failure combined. Now hold that against the arithmetic of the defense. At 5,000 feet, a Japanese anti-aircraft gunner finally had a target he could reach. The standard Type 88-75mm gun had an effective vertical reach of about 7,250 meters. Hopeless against a bomber at 10,000, entirely adequate against one at 1,500. The enemy had come down into the envelope, and it changed almost nothing. Because here is the sentence that no engineer in Tokyo had ever wanted to write. By the time the Japanese aviation industry had finally, painfully, over 3 years of desperate work, begun to produce fighters capable of climbing to meet the superfortress at altitude, the superfortress had stopped flying at altitude. The Nakajima Ki-87, ordered in July of 1943, promising 3 prototypes by January 1945. Exactly one flew, in April 1945, weeks after LeMay had already changed the war. the Tachikawaki 94, scheduled for its first flight on August 18, 1945. 3 days after the surrender, every intercooler duct that had failed to fit, every hand-brazed exhaust ring that had leaked and given 3 prototypes 3 different ceilings, every young pilot who had climbed for an hour and watched his oil pressure sag towards zero at 7,000 meters. Every one of them had been racing to solve a problem that had just quietly ceased to exist. The Americans had come down out of the sky and left an entire aviation industry chasing a shadow. The heavier weapons tell the same story from the other end. The Type 3 12-centimeter gun could genuinely reach a superfortress at altitude. Roughly 150 were built, in a country defending itself with nearly 3,000 heavy guns. The answer to that gap was the Type 5, a 15-centimeter weapon. Effective ceiling of 16,000 meters, a superb piece of engineering that could have reached anything in the sky. 2 were completed. 2, both were emplaced at Kugayama on the western edge of Tokyo. On August 1st, 1945, in a single engagement, those 2 guns brought down 2 bombers. After which the raids simply routed around Kugayama, and the guns never fired at an aircraft again. 2 guns. A capital city, 9 months of nightly fire. That is what it looks like when the design office is decades ahead of the foundry. And the warning problem sat underneath all of it. Japanese land-based radar was short-ranged. The picket boats that might have extended it were being sunk faster than they could be replaced. So the defenders typically had about an hour's notice that raiders were inbound. Signals intelligence could sometimes do better on timing, but it could not say where the raid was going. An hour is not enough time to get fighters from a standing start to 30,000 feet and into position. Not with a climb like the Shokis, which is why most raids were met by small handfuls of aircraft. Arriving individually, exactly as Oishi had described, never as a formation, always alone, into the massed fire of a bomber box. Consider what it took to fight anyway. On January 27th, 1945, Kobayashi dove on a superfortress. He hit it. His fighter was destroyed in the collision. He took to his parachute, landed, and walked away with bruises. He was shot down again in April. He was wounded. By May, he was flying a new fighter. Built by taking the Kawasaki Ki-61 airframe and hanging a plain reliable radial engine on the front of it. Because the sophisticated engine had beaten them. The country that had once dreamed of turbochargers and pressurized cabins was now taking the good engine off and putting a simpler one on. Because simple was what they could still build, he survived the war. Here is the final ledger of the campaign he fought. Across roughly 27,000 American bomber sorties over Japan, Japanese fighters shot down 74 superfortresses. Anti-aircraft guns accounted for 54 more, and another 19 fell to some combination of the 2. In defending the home islands, the Japanese air forces lost about 1,450 aircraft in combat, and another 2,750 to everything else. By the last weeks, LeMay could say that it was safer to fly a combat mission over Japan than to fly a training mission back in the United States. And now, the verdict. There is one loose end in the archives that says more than any statistic. Those 3 rebuilt flying fortresses, the ones with the turbo superchargers. The ones photographed for the magazines, studied component by component, parceled out to specialists flown by Japanese crews. They vanished. One was wrecked in a takeoff accident in early 1944. The others were seen in reconnaissance photographs, and then were not. When American investigators combed Japan after the surrender, the Strategic Bombing Survey noted that the Japanese had evaluated fortresses, but recorded finding none. In thousands of occupation photographs there is not one image of them. Where they went, who moved them, nobody has ever established. The most closely studied objects in the Japanese aeronautical world simply left no trace, which is a strangely exact ending, because the knowledge they carried left no trace either. So why could the engineers not explain it? Not because they were outclassed as engineers. They had dissected the device, published it, understood the thermodynamics, and had turbocharged designs in hand before the enemy bomber existed. The reason is harder and quieter than that. An engineer is trained to explain a machine by taking it apart. And this machine's explanation was not inside it, it was in an ore body in Ontario, in a casting process invented for false teeth in a New York laboratory, in a refinery producing fuel that Japan had not been permitted to buy since 1940, and in a secret cable signed in March of 1941 that quietly redirected an island's nickel to the other side of the world. There is no line on a technical drawing where you can write down a mine you do not own. That is the thing about altitude. It looks like a property of an aircraft. Two numbers in a performance table, and you can compare them. But the numbers in that table were never really being generated in the design office. They were being generated in mines, in smelters, in foundries, in refineries, months and years upstream, in decisions taken by people who never saw an airplane. By the time the consequence arrives, 9,000 meters over your capital city. On a cloudless morning, it is far too late for anyone with a slide rule to do anything about it. Which brings us back to a man in a converted bomber with 3 cameras and no bombs. Ralph Steakley's photographs took weeks to develop, and months to fully analyze. They mapped the engine plants, the airfields, the docks, and also, incidentally, the dense wooden residential districts that would burn in March. The general who sent him later said it was probably the greatest single contribution made to the air war against Japan. That one cloudless morning was never repeated. Not one other day of the entire campaign gave that weather. Steakley was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. His crew were all decorated. He outlived the war by more than 60 years. He never fired a shot on the mission that made him. And beneath him that afternoon an entire air defense system. Good aircraft, brave men, competent engineers, correct physics. Climbed as hard as it could, ran out of air and watched. There is one more story to tell before we close. Teruhiko Kobayashi lived through the war. He put down his uniform. He spent 9 years in civilian life in a country that no longer had an air force, in a Tokyo that had burned around him and been rebuilt in wood and concrete over the same street plan he had defended from 12,000 meters. Then his country asked him back. Japan's post-war self-defense force needed pilots who had commanded men in combat. There were not many left. Kobayashi joined. He was trained on American jets. The very country whose bombers he had rammed with the wings of a Ki-61 was now the country whose aircraft he was learning to fly. On June 4, 1957, a trainer he was flying out of Hamamatsu developed a fault just after takeoff. He was climbing over a residential district, the kind of street that had burned in the tens of thousands 12 years before. He ordered his co-pilot to eject, and he stayed with the aircraft, trying to steer it away from the houses. He was 36. The youngest regimental commander in the Japanese Army Air Force. The man who had climbed a Ki-61 into the massed guns of a superfortress and walked away from the parachute landing with bruises. The man whose entire generation of engineers had failed to give him an engine that would carry him where he needed to go. Died protecting the people on the ground beneath him. The same people who had stood in the doorways of Tokyo. On the 1st of November 1944 and looked up at a lone American aircraft they could not reach. Remember Oishi, remember Awamura, whose parachute came down 20 kilometers from the nearest coast and who was never found. Remember Corporal Mita, 20 years old, who took a superfortress out of the sky by flying his fighter into it because his country could not give him a wheel that would not melt. Remember Sanford Mott, who died in Lynn, Massachusetts, 946. Whose obsession, dismissed for 20 years as a charming dead end, had quietly decided a war on the other side of the world, and about whom no film has ever been made. Remember Eddie Allen, who took the second prototype into the sky on a February afternoon in Seattle, and came down through the roof of a meat-packing plant with his crew and 20 strangers. Remember the men in shirt sleeves 9,000 meters up, working in a warm sealed cabin, above a country that had never been permitted to buy the metal it would have needed to touch them. None of them chose the ground their countries were standing on. They only had to fly what it produced, and the altitude at which any of them lived or died was not a number in a design office in Seattle or Nakajima. It was a percentage in a mining report, a shipping contract, a cable, a dental laboratory in New York, a mountain in Colorado where a 46-year-old engineer had spent 6 weeks in the freezing air, proving that an engine at 14,000 feet could make the same power as an engine on the ground. 26 years before a young lieutenant named Oishi Sadao lifted the nose of his shoki. In the clean November sky over Tokyo, reached for the cannon button, and felt his aircraft fall out from under him before he could fire a shot.